started. My name is Maggie Ray, and I will be co-hosting with our presenter. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's Beginning Gardener series is on plant selection. During the program, please stay muted the whole time and do not share video. If you become unmuted or you have video that is showing, I have the capability to go in and turn that off for you. If you have any questions for the presenter during the program, please type them into the chat box and we will ask the questions at the end of the program. If you have any technical questions or problems with your viewing of the program, please refer those to the chat box as well, or you can email me. All of that information, including my email, is located in the chat box. So if you just scroll up to the beginning of the conversations that have been going on, we will have it'll have that information with my email. As usual, this program is being recorded, and as soon as it is made available to us, it'll be emailed out in the form of our YouTube channel, and you'll be getting that email tonight after this program because one of our past programs is already put up. Our presenter tonight is Katie Bell. Katie is a University of Illinois Extension local foods and small farms educator in Southern Illinois. She covers Jackson, Franklin, Williamson, Randolph, and Perry counties. With that, I will go ahead and let Katie take it away. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As Maggie said, my name is Katie Bell, and we're going to be talking about plant selection tonight. All right, so we're just going to jump right into it. Okay, so whenever we think about plant selection, there are several different things that can kind of go into that consideration. And so when we just think about what plants are we going to choose, you might want to think about where you're planting at. Because if we're planting in an area that has full sun exposure, kind of like we talked about last Tuesday, 8 to 10 hours, you can plant pretty much anything that's vegetable crop related: tomatoes, cucumbers, any of your squashes, peppers. They'll all do well in full sun. However, if you have a spot that doesn't quite receive as much sunlight, maybe you only get 5 or 6 hours of sunlight, you might want to think about doing some sort of cooler season crop whenever you can at the beginning of the season. Or if you're thinking about some decorative houseplants, something that's more shade loving. But cool season crops like lettuce and spinach, they will do okay with a little bit less light than some of our warm season summer crops like tomatoes or cucumbers. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So where you're planting is important to think about. Also, whenever you're thinking about space that you're going to be having, how much space you have can determine what you plant as well. If you have a lot of space where you're able to allow cucurbit vines to spread out and to take up lots of room, that is ideal. However, if you only have a small amount of space, you might want something that is more bushing. There are bush cucumbers that allow you to be able to plant in a closer crop spacing and don't have large vines that come out. The same thing with beans. There are pole beans, and they need a lot of room to climb, and they can quickly take over an area and can shade out or smother out some of your other crops. So you want to be careful with that. So if you still want to have some sort of green bean, you can plant from a variety of bush beans. So another thing to think about is what do you like to eat? If you're going to be planting a garden, you don't want to grow a bunch of things that you're not interested in eating. So you're going to want to think about that. And maybe with that, if you like tomatoes, how do you like to eat tomatoes? Do you prefer cherry tomatoes where you just can pick them off the vines and just eat them, or do you prefer to only have sandwiches and to only have tomatoes with sandwiches? Or if you're going to take tomatoes and turn them into sauce, that can kind of determine varieties and sizes of plants that you might also select. How much time are you willing to invest in your garden? Are you going to be able to be out there every day or every other day to be weeding and taking care of things? If you've got something that needs watered on a really regular basis, that's something else to think about. And then also with time, sorry about that, the dog is following me around. Are you going to be able to have one harvest or multiple harvests? So if you're going to have enough time, you can do multiple harvests of things like tomatoes again, cucumbers, squash, peppers. They will all need harvested once they get going, a couple of times a week sometimes. But if you're wanting to plant something and you want something that you're going to have at the end of the season, you might think about potatoes or carrots. They're kind of a one and done. You plant them and then you wait a while and you're able to dig and harvest most of them all at one time. And so if you're going to be preserving, that will also kind of factor into what plants you're going to be wanting to select, because and how many of them you choose, because if you choose something like an indeterminate tomato, you're going to be getting fruit from it all season, but it's going to be a little bit more sporadic. Whereas if you have a determinate tomato, and we will go into this a little bit further as we get along, a determinate tomato is going to stay smaller. They're going to stay lower to the ground, so that can also be part of your space consideration. And they're going to have a really heavy flush of fruit for a 2 to 3 week period where you're going to see most of your fruit. So if you're planning on canning or preserving and making sauces, you may want to think about doing something like a determinate tomato where you get a flush all at once. Whereas if you're thinking about just wanting a fresh tomato every now and then, an indeterminate may be something that you're more interested in. So this is just kind of an example of space consideration. This is a volunteer pumpkin plant. And on the right, this is what it started out with. It was just a little plant that came up and just a few leaves, and you didn't really think of anything of it. And then in about a month's time, it had taken over to this point and was crawling all over my porch. And by the end of the season, you can't really see the edge of this bush here, but it had completely gotten into the bush, and we had pumpkin. And this is just one pumpkin vine. This is not multiple plantings. This is just from one plant that came up. So that's really the things like pumpkins or anything in that cucurbit family can really take over in vine. And so you need a lot of space for them and to allow them to have an adequate space, and then also to keep them from shading out some of your other less competitive plants that you might have. These are determinate tomatoes. As you can see, they stay shorter. They're usually around 3 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet tall, and then they stop growing, and they're a bit bushier. And they set their fruit, like I said, pretty regularly, and so they need harvested.
How far apart they are.
They stay harvested about once to twice a week. And these particular ones, we set these in at, I believe, 1.5 to 2 feet, and then trellis them with this Florida weave system. And that works really well for these determinate tomatoes, but as you'll see in a minute, it does not work very well for the indeterminate tomatoes that I was talking about. So this is a completely different growing system, but these are some indeterminate tomatoes. This is a cherry tomato. And as you can see, they get extremely tall. This vine starts here and then it ends all the way up here. And these are grown in a hydroponic tunnel, but the idea is that you're able to trim the leaves off and they just keep growing, and we just keep dropping this string down and we continue to have a long tomato vine. And the same thing can be done with cucumbers. If you have the right setup, you can trellis them as well and just keep coiling the vines. Something to think about with time is some crops are not going to be able to compete with weeds, so you're really going to have to be out there caring for your garden and keeping weeds away, and trying to provide a more ideal growing setting for your crops. And other crops other plants tend to be much hardier and can withstand a little bit of weed competition. Again, as I had mentioned earlier, crops like cucumbers and tomatoes need to be harvested regularly. If you don't keep up with your harvests on especially tomatoes, for example, you will have you can develop pest problems, both insect pest problems. If you have fruit that is over ripening on the vine, that can attract insect pests to come in. For example, like spotted winged Drosophila can come in and then create a problem for you. And also you can attract, if you leave ripe fruit on the vine for too long, that can also attract things like raccoons and potentially rabbits to come in and start eating your fruit off your vines. Zucchini and squash plants will stop producing if you don't harvest them, and they'll go ahead and continue with their life cycle and then die off if you don't keep harvesting them. And as I said again, onions and potatoes and garlic, they're all crops that will be harvested once. So you'll plant them out, and they tend to also have a bit of a longer growing season. So they're something that you can kind of put out and harvest once at the end of the season, if you don't have a lot of time in your hands, but you still want to have access to good fresh fruits and vegetables. So another thing to think about is your plant hardiness zones. And I'll have a good graphic here in just a second that will kind of help me talk about this and explain a little bit. But determining what zone you're in will also allow you to select crops that are right for your area. And usually whenever you are looking at plants on a seed catalog or at the store and you're reading on the back of seed packets, there's generally a good picture that shows you your hardiness zones and then tells you what hardiness zone the crop is in. And so that will help you make your determinations about what you can grow in your area. Some plants will grow in an area that they are not, that they don't belong in the hardiness zone, but they may not be able to survive the winter there. So they may not be, some plants that would be perennials in their natural hardiness zone will not be in areas with colder climates. Something else that you can do to kind of get around the hardiness zones a little bit is to be able to choose earlier or later maturing varieties based on your location. So if you know that you're going to, live in an area where you have earlier summers and it gets warmer earlier, so if you're somewhere that, sorry about that, I just hit the mute button, somewhere that you have access to, you can have an earlier maturing variety, and then that way you can kind of escape some of that. If you have an early winter coming in, you can escape that if your crop has already matured and then you've been able to harvest it a few times. So this is Illinois plant hardiness zone map from the USDA, and this is a really good reference for you to look at and kind of fine tune it, because usually the maps are nationwide maps, and so this, you can just get online and look up plant hardiness zone if you happen to be from a different state than Illinois, and you can just look up the hardiness zone for your state. So I am in Murfreesboro in Jackson County, and it looks like we are in this 6B zone, and so that will allow us, and it is based on your average annual extreme minimum temperature. So for us, our average extreme is -5 to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So something that you can, I had talked a little bit about cool season crops a little bit earlier, and so to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper, these crops are typically grown in the early spring and they do best below 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So this, right now, we are still kind of in our cool season crop season, I suppose you could say. And so we're still seeing a lot of lettuce, spinach, kale, broccoli. You can do, and cauliflower as well. They can all be grown in the early spring. And you can also grow some of these in the fall as well before it gets too cold. However, day length can start to be an issue in the fall. Even if the crops can handle the frosting at night, they may not be able to grow. They may not grow as quickly because they are not receiving enough light or as much light as they would during the spring months. And some crops also need to be started indoors before the last frost, or you won't be able to get them harvested fast enough before it gets too hot. And one thing with spring crops that starts to become an issue as it starts to heat up is they will bolt, and so they will see this rapid, especially in lettuces, we see it rapid tall vegetative growth. And so generally when we think of lettuce and it's in a nice tight head or bunch, bolting will cause those leaves to be spread out and set farther apart, and we don't want that for eating or selling. And then another thing with lettuce, in the heat of the summer, it will start to get kind of take on a bitter taste, and so that is not ideal either. So when we look here, this is a really nice graphic from Seed Saver Exchange. Cool season crops, and this kind of goes through the what to start indoors or direct seed. So it's talking about hardy temperatures, vegetables that are hardy and semi-hardy, so they can tolerate heavy frosts, the hardy ones, and then semi-hardy are able to tolerate light frost. Something that you can also do if you're able to is you can use low tunnels if you're planting outside, so that would be like a short half hoop and then covered with a clear plastic. Another thing that you can do is simply use row covers, and all that does is it keeps the frost off, and then it provides just enough heat from the ground to keep the plants from freezing off. If you plan to plant early enough that you're going to be encountering frosts with things like kale and spinach, one thing that you can do is allow them to kind of thaw out in the morning. So if you come in and you see that it's frosted, you allow enough time for the plants to thaw out. So maybe you wait until noon or 1 o'clock before you harvest them, and then you're able to harvest them without any damage or wilt. Because if you go in and harvest them whenever they're still frozen, they'll just break off, and then once they do thaw out, they'll be kind of a mushy mess. So warm season crops are usually what we think of whenever we think of a vegetable garden. They're your tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, any of your squashes. That's all going to be good warm season crops, and they grow best during summer months. They need heat, they need a lot of light. They typically are not frost tolerant or not very frost tolerant. When we think about peppers and tomatoes in particular, we always know whenever the first frost has come if you still have tomato plants out, because they start to get kind of an odd almost translucent look to the skin, or kind of watery looking, and then so that damages, it may not kill the plants, but it damages the fruit enough that you're not able to continue harvesting them. So something to think about if you're thinking about planting your warm season vegetable crops, they may require some irrigation depending on where you have them planted and what area you're located in, and the soil type. So if you have a really sandy, loose soil that the water moves through very rapidly, you're probably going to need to irrigate more frequently than you would in a clay soil that's going to be able to hold the moisture. And so picking crops that match your soil type can be really important as well. So when we think about, I had mentioned briefly annuals and perennials. So annuals, as we know, they complete their life cycle within a year, and they need to be replanted every year. This makes crop rotation easy. So if you might be moving your garden around, or if you want to set up a crop rotation system to prevent disease or insect buildup or weed buildup, the annuals are a good choice for rotating crops. One thing that you have to think about is bed preparation will need to be done each year. So if you are plowing a garden, you'll have to do that each year before you go in and plant your new crop, or if you're doing any kind of transplanting or conservation tillage, that will have to be done each year. And depending on the crops that you choose, some of them have higher nutrient requirements than others, and so you'll have to factor that into your planting plan as well. Another thing with annual crops, planting can be delayed by poor weather conditions. So if you have an extremely wet spring and you can't get out into the garden to plow, that can affect whenever you're able to, when you do get your plants in the ground, it may be later than you would ideally like, and that can shorten up your season. Perennial plants can last for years, and so you can plant them. You only have to plant them once, and then if they're successful and well maintained, you can harvest from them for years. So a few examples would be blueberries, blackberries, asparagus, and then any of your caneberries, so blackberries and raspberries. I know blueberries can be extremely productive and fruitful if they're cared for more than 30 years. So if you take good care of them, you'll have a good supply of blueberries for many years. Just as with any crop, they need to be maintained regularly. So that might be pruning, and then they'll need regular fertilizer, and you'll have to also make sure that you're doing something to suppress the weeds around them. So whether that's mulching or using some sort of herbicide to protect them. One thing with these crops is if you get a really late frost, it could damage crops. So I'm thinking especially of fruit trees like peach trees that could be damaged by a late frost. And so that's something to consider as well when you're thinking about plants. Perennials are going to be a permanent fixture in your landscape until you decide to remove them. So if you're not sure that you want your garden where it is right now, then you may want to just stick with the annuals. But if you have a nice open flat spot and you know that you want to put something there and you're going to be able to dedicate several years to it, then something like asparagus may be a good fit for that. And it does take several years to get it established and get it ready to harvest, but once you have it up and going, you can harvest asparagus from it for many years. So another factor that goes into plant selection, once you have selected what plants you want to plant, then you kind of want to narrow down within that what varieties you need. And so one thing we look at whenever we're considering varieties for plant selection is any disease resistance that we may have. So I talk about tomatoes a lot, but tomatoes and cucumbers and then any of the squashes can be especially prone to different diseases. So tomatoes have several various wilts that they are susceptible to, and cucumbers and squash usually have problems with downy mildew. So or powdery mildew, I'm sorry. And so that's something that we think about whenever we're looking at plants and trying to decide which ones to choose. So most of your common vegetable crops do have resistant varieties that are really good. And this is just a link to an article that talks about vegetable seed resistance and disease resistance, and kind of can give you a few ideas. Whenever you look at any seed catalogs, they'll provide resistant hybrids. These are usually in the form of a 1 or 2 letter code in the plant description. However, they usually also have a chart on the website that lets you know what those letters symbolize. Heirloom crops, people really like them. And especially I'm thinking of heirloom tomatoes. A lot of people say that they have very unique flavors, and they're tend to be a very unique and striking fruit. However, they typically don't have any kind of disease resistance bred into them, and so it can be tricky to take care of them, and they usually require just a little bit extra maintenance to help keep them healthy and going. So whenever you're going to purchase plants and you're looking at making your selection, you want to buy from a reputable supplier, and you can go online and order, or you can go to a nursery and pick out plants. So you want to be able to choose plants that are generally healthy, which means that they have a good green color to the leaves, that really healthy green. You don't want any holes or discoloration to the leaves. you typically don't want to see any wilting of the leaves, and then you want to avoid getting plants that look like they are stretched or leggy. And then I have a picture to kind of show that a little bit better here in a second. You also want to, if you're able to, if you can get your hands on the plants. So if you're at your garden center or a nursery, you can kind of check out the potting soil that they're in, and then if you kind of pull them lightly out of the pack, you want to make sure that they have a good root system to be able to transplant. One thing that you want to be careful of whenever you buy plants is that if you're buying a vegetable plant that is extremely large or top heavy, sometimes it can have a little bit of it can be a little bit more stressed whenever you go to transplant it into the ground than something that's a bit smaller, because the roots are just that much more shocked and stressed out than they are whenever the plant is small. So you want a smaller proportional plant, so about 6 to 8 inches tall if you're talking about something like tomatoes, and you want everything to look proportional. So you don't want a really thin stem or spidery looking leaves, because that can just kind of point out to unhealthiness. And then also if you look and you notice that the plants are, that if you notice that a lot of the plants are dried out or not being watered properly, that's something to just kind of look out for. So this is kind of an example of that stretching or that legginess that can happen. This can happen for several reasons. Sometimes they get stressed out in the pot that they're in, so it may be too small. This can also happen as they're stretching for light. So this is not a natural tallness. This is not the way this plant should look. As you can see, there's a lot of space between each of the branches, and so that kind of all indicates this stretchiness. And so there's a lot more stem in proportion to what there are to the leaves. So these are just a couple of different plant supply companies. Some of these only supply mostly seeds, and then others also supply transplants. So I've used seed from most of these suppliers, and they're all very good, or bought in plants from them. This is not endorsing one company over the other. These are just all ones that I have had personal experience with, and so I would recommend that you just do some research and look around and try to find what works best for you. So this is just what they provide different catalogs for all different. So if we go to this is the Stokes website. I just picked one here. And we can go in and we can see they provide all different varieties. So here, for example, this is a hybrid cabbage, and I'll see if we can find some of the descriptions. So it's talking about a yellow's tolerant, so it doesn't get the yellow edges. And this is a quick description, or a quick maturing variety, and it gives you the days to maturity. And so this is all good places to gather information whenever you're trying to decide what varieties or crops that you're looking at to choose. Is just go to some of these different seed websites and read the information. And I would always recommend that you just make some comparisons and do what works best for you personally. So I talked about this last time, but I think it's good to cover again if we're talking about plant selection. Whenever we are planting, we always want to make sure that we're planting after the last frost date. So if you watched this site selection and preparation, you've seen this, but I'm going to go ahead and show it again because I think it's a really good resource. So this is the average last frost date map for Illinois. And these zones are, you'll notice that they have zones as well, but these zones are different than the plant hardiness zones that we talked about earlier. So just don't confuse them. But this provides a really good resource for when your last frost date is, and that will help you decide whenever you can put your transplants out or put your seeds in the ground, depending on what they recommend. So you want to, as I said, maintain a good seed to soil contact. So that means you want to make sure that your soil is loose enough that it can cover the seed and provide adequate moisture to it to start that germination process. And then you also want to make sure that you're watering it in, because that helps settle the soil. And then it also provides the moisture the plant needs to get started to germinate. So if you're using transplants, like most of us probably will be now, if you're going and buying plants from the garden center or from a nursery, you're going to want to make sure that you, when you remove the plant from the package or the root ball that it's in, you're going to want to give the roots a light massage, just kind of loosen that up, so that will stimulate them once you put them in the ground to grow and spread out and not just stay within the hole that you dug for them. So you're going to want to make sure that you properly cover the root system and then water them in. If you're doing something like potatoes and you're starting from a seed potato, so you're starting from an eye that you have cut off, you'll just do it the same way that you would a seed. So you're going to put it in the ground and cover it and then water it. One thing to consider with potatoes is that you'll have to hill them several times. So you'll have to, as the plant grows, you will add more dirt to the top of the hill to cover all but a few of the leaves, so that way you can sort of maximize the root growth and then eventually the tubers that you will harvest. So just some concluding thoughts. I kind of went a little bit quicker than I intended to, but so some things to think about. What are your goals with your garden? Are you wanting to feed your family and then have enough left over that you can and have preserved food to go through the winter? Or maybe you want to make some sauces with tomatoes, or you're making pickles. You'll want to think about that whenever you consider what varieties you're selecting, whether you're going to have determinate or indeterminate tomatoes. If you, as I'd said before, if you're thinking about having sort of a big canning day and you want a large flush of tomatoes within the span of a few weeks, then you may want to go with some determinate tomatoes, and that way you have a lot to work with at one time. Otherwise, you may only want some fresh herbs for the summer. So you'll just choose a few different herbs that you can keep in a small window box or a small raised bed outside, and then you'll have fresh herbs. So you want to just kind of consider your goals when you're thinking about plants. And again, I cannot stress enough how think about how much space you have, because if you have, as I'd said before, plants that cannot compete well or might get shaded out, you don't want to put them in too close of proximity with something like a cucumber or a cantaloupe that's going to really vine out and have a lot of big leaves and going to shade out some of your shorter, weaker plants. And let me go back here. How will you handle, you want to think about how you're going to handle disease issues. Are you willing to spray different fungicides or do a lot of heavy pruning to try to keep down disease issues? Are you going to add some extra space in between your plants? Or are you going to go with maybe a hybrid variety that has some different disease resistances? So that's something to think about whenever you're thinking about different plant selections. And then you also want to think about where are you going to get your plants. Are you going to be ordering them online? Are you going to be trying to start from seed, or are you going to be ordering transplants that are already ready to be put in the ground? If you're thinking about starting from seed, you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time and that you also have some place that you are able to start your seeds if you're going to be starting them indoors before you put them outside. So with that, does anybody have any questions?
Yes, we do have some questions.
Okay.
And if I might have, they were flooding in at one point for a minute, and I may have missed some, but I know I have answered some, and Austin is also on here, and he's answered a few.
Okay.
Okay, so first we had a question at the very beginning that says, can you still plant or direct seed cool weather crops right now? And this person is in zone 5B, and to give you an idea of where they're at, I looked it up. They're in Bettendorf, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Iowa, which is southeast Iowa, and it's on the Illinois and Iowa border. It's by our counties like Rock Island and Whiteside. It's on that side.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
So let me just go back to that way I'm sure that I'm talking right here.
yeah.
So we're 5B, so we are, you said like the Rock Island side?
Yeah, kind of up there by Rock Island.
Okay.
Their county's right
Yeah.
beside it.
Here we go.
Okay,
Okay.
yep, a little farther up.
Okay. All right. So we're like over this way.
Yeah.
I would say yes, you can go ahead and still direct seed some of your cool season crops, especially the ones that could just are happy to go right into the ground. So I know spinach, kale, some of your lettuces, they're pretty hardy, and once they come up, if you happen to get a late frost, they'll be, especially spinach, can kind of hunker down and they'll be able to wait it out. If you're concerned about it, you can use a light row cover as long as you're able to pin it down and keep it from blowing away.
Okay. We had a question that was what kind of fertilizers to use on perennial berry plants. And I know Austin, or maybe he sent that to me, he had given like a kind of a generic answer. But if you have any recommendations for that. And Thursday we are doing plant nutrition, just in case.
Yes. So I don't have any specific recommendations. Probably if you want to pass along the information that Austin had, and then as you said, we're doing plant nutrition on Thursday, so I think that may be something we definitely want to cover.
Okay. This one is about they have planted seeds, and what steps would you take to stop them from getting leggy? And they didn't give much context, but I'm almost wondering if they didn't mean starting seeds in their home.
Okay, so I run into this problem myself with leggy plants. I don't have a good south-facing window, so they kind of want to stretch and get leggy towards the light. I would say if you can, make sure you're providing good light to them, good direct sunlight, or if you can have access to being able to get some sort of grow light. Another thing would be giving them enough space so that way they're not competing with each other too much for light, because that's something else that will happen is they'll get stretchy and they'll try to outcompete each other for the light. They will recover from it for the most part once you get them transplanted outside or transplanted into bigger pots once they get a little more space. So they'll recover from it, but it just can kind of slow them down. So if you're purchasing plants, I wouldn't purchase them that way. But if you have a little bit of stretchiness, it's not the end of the world.
Okay. Someone asked about the best tomato variety to make large quantities of salsa. And they said they were in I think they said the Spring Valley area of Illinois.
Oh, okay. So the best variety to make salsa, that I think that probably it would depend on who you ask. I know that if you're just looking for a good, you're probably going to want something that has a lot of flesh, so not a lot of cavity space in there. Gosh, I don't know a specific variety off the top of my head. I know that we use red deuce is a good one, just for a good general red tomato. And I think that one's usually a pretty strong producer. And then I know that Florida 91 is an older variety that people still really like as a general tomato. I could look into that a little bit more and give some more suggestions, but off the top of my head,
Yeah.
that's what I have right now.
We also have suggestions in the chat box as well. People are
Okay.
chiming in with all their different ones too.
Good.
And
Yeah.
then we kind of had a question from someone asking, it's going to snow in their area tonight, and what kind of plants, bushes, flowers would they need to cover today? And I know that would depend on everything that they actually have out. But if you had a quick kind of spiel about maybe that.
Okay. Yeah. So if you have stuff that's going to be sensitive to frost, so if you've already got some of your warmer weather plants out, I would definitely go ahead and cover those and button them down tight if you can, or move them inside if you're able. If you have stuff that's been outside all winter and has held up this far, it should be fine. Or if you have things that you've direct seeded outside and they're used to this weather, and the cooler nights, they'll probably be okay. If you are worried about them, you could go ahead and put a cover on them. But I would say if the seedlings have been started outside and have come up and they're a cool season crop, then they should probably be fine, unless you're planning on getting a lot of snow. I'm not sure where they're at, but that would be my general recommendation.
All right. And then we had someone ask about what kind of fertilizer would you use for tomatoes?
So a general one that we just start with field dressing is a triple 19, which is just in the NP and K, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and those that would be a good general fertilizer to put on. You'll want to make sure that you have enough calcium and potassium in your soils, because tomatoes will get blossom end rot if they don't have enough calcium. So that's something, especially with tomatoes, to kind of keep an eye on is the calcium and the potassium. And you can see issues sometimes that look like nutrient deficiencies, and sometimes this can also be a water issue. So if they're not getting enough water, they won't be able to take up the nutrients even if they are in the soil.
Okay. You mentioned the importance of harvesting zucchini to prevent plant death. How do you get bigger zucchini without killing plants?
So whenever you think about harvesting zucchini, when I say, so your plant is going to be producing several buds at one time, several blossoms at one time. As long as you have a few plants growing on there all the time and you're taking at least some off, it should be okay. So you can let them mature to full size, and then harvest them. You just don't want to, for example, last summer I had a zucchini plant out in my garden and I forgot about it. And by the time I watered, by the time I remembered it, the zucchini on it were huge. I mean, they looked like small watermelons. And by that point it was too late. So anything, it's pretty much letting them go to the point where they wouldn't be edible anyway. So as long as you're harvesting them when they're mature and ready to eat, you're not going to have a problem with plants dying or going through their full life cycle.
Okay. Going back to the question about like kind of what plants to protect, they're asking about strawberries that have already came up, if they would need covered.
Sorry about that. The dog was barking and I had myself on mute.
That's okay.
So with strawberries, depending on where you're at, I know that a lot of people grow them on plastic, so that will help the soil heat up on the bottom. But as far as covering them, as long as you're not getting a frost at night, as long as you're not getting a frost at night, you shouldn't have to cover them. I'm not extremely familiar with strawberries. I know that they like it cooler, so once it does get hot, they usually slow down or are done. were these the same people that had asked the question about covering, or were these was this a different person?
I think this is a different person.
Okay, I wasn't sure, so that way I could kind of fine tune it. But yes, I would say that as long as it's not I always get think about covering in terms of using in a high tunnel, and so we let it get a little bit colder before we have to cover things in the high tunnel. I would say outside though, as long as you're not going to get a frost, you probably don't need to cover. Does Austin or do you have anything to add to that, Maggie?
I don't, but maybe
Okay.
Austin might.
All right, thank you.
Not sure. Okay, so we'll go on. We might come back to that. Are we pretty much past the date of starting tomatoes from seed inside?
I started some inside last week or 2 weeks ago, so I think depending on where you are, I think you still could, but they might be kind of late. So I would say we're a little bit past for the most part. You might get them up and get a couple harvests, but at this point you may be better off going and getting some transplants to put out.
Okay. Let me read this. Oh, are there natural ways to prevent powdery mildew in cucumbers besides weeding?
So one thing that you can do with cucumbers and the powdery mildew is having a as wide of plant spacing as you can, and if you can, trellis them up. So encourage them to climb up a fence panel or a pallet, or even if you use some sort of string trellis system to keep them off the ground, that will help. And then trimming the lower leaves, so just below below the fruit clusters, because you don't want to trim off any fruit clusters, but you can prune off some of the lower leaves, and that will help. And then also don't, if you can avoid it, don't overhead water them. So don't just blast them with the hose. You know, if you can, either just water the ground or maybe use some sort of drip irrigation system, and that will help.
Okay. And Austin had kind of chimed in on that one as well. And he said to keep airflow open, and then also you could use a copper-based fungicide.
Yes.
An organic one. So, all right. And then last question I see on here. Oh, if there is concern with strawberries. Oh, they were just saying to throw a sheet or a tablecloth over them if you have concern, you know.
Yeah,
yeah.
better
I do know
yeah.
it is going to be, I know tonight here in Southern Illinois, I think what did it say, 29, you know?
Yeah.
So it is going to be pretty cold.
It's going to be chilly, yes.
Yes. But all right, that seems to be all the questions that I have.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Okay. Thank you.